thank you, Stefana. Cool. I'm going to start with a story. Many years ago, somebody from Node.js posted, hey, we've got a great first issue. Come on our GitHub and check it out. And this friend of mine saw that issue and said like, oh, I can do this. I can contribute to open source. It was like a change to the website they wanted. So this friend of mine, they cloned the repository, they went to their editor, and they started like getting everything set up, doing all the NPM installs and all the NPM run devs and all that. And in a few moments, they kind of came to a blocker with a couple of questions. And I'd love to check if this has happened to any of y'all before, where they go like, ooh, what if somebody's already working on this issue and I'm kind of like stepping on their toes? Or how do I claim this issue without making a silly person of myself? Or maybe they ask themselves, like, what if I take too long and I'm blocking once I've claimed the issue? Or worse, what if my PR is no good and they tell me to go away and then I never contribute to open source again? Has anybody ever had these kinds of doubts before? My friends certainly did. So once they had these blockers and they kind of, put down their computer, and then I never did anything. Right, sorry, I forgot to mention the little twist for this story. It was me. I was the friend. And with that very subtle, we're going to segue into who I am. Hi, my name is Ramón. My pronouns are he, him. I am originally from Chile, and I'm living in Austria. This is my first time in New York. Thank you so much for having me. Oh, thank you. I've been contributing to many open source projects over the years, and that community aspect of being able to share knowledge and sort of help elevate others is something that is very near and dear to my heart. And one question that I've seen, especially as I started coaching people in their early careers, come up is this question: how do I get started in open source? And maybe some of y'all have asked yourself this question too. And there's some excellent resources out there that are provided by folks like GitHub's open source guide. There's OpenSauce. Has anybody heard of OpenSauce? I'm curious. Cool. Yeah, no, there are some great places to sort of go look for issues to get started. I'd love to share with you, if I may, how did I get started in open source? And I'm going to give a little bit of background. So living in Austria, the only way that I could work and be allowed to stay there at the time, it was complicated. I could only freelance. And so I was doing lots of, at the time, this was like Mac OS with Objective-C, some Ruby on Rails, and I was having a good time, but very quickly I started feeling isolated. I wasn't really collaborating with folks much. So I started going to meetups. I should mention, I'm a shy person. And so like it took me a little while to feel comfortable doing so. But then as I started joining these communities, I started coaching at workshops like Rails Girls, for helping underrepresented folks get into Ruby on Rails development. This is quite a while ago that I was doing this coaching, and I was doing lots of mentoring. I was, making improvement to the tutorials. I was learning to install Ruby on Rails on Windows, which was a thing at the time. And then through that, I started contributing to the Rails Girls Summer of Code project. Has anybody heard of this, by the way? It was fantastic, sadly defunct. What it was is a crowdfunded open source initiative for helping underrepresented folks from around the world get paid to contribute to open source and get a leg up on their career, which was amazing. And so, and I started out by volunteering, then I became a coach, and before I knew it, I was, contributing as an organizer. And there's a lot of these where I got started like this, where I was just kind of like, poking around and then sort of like joined the team. And it was really, really gratifying for me. I also worked on some stuff like where2help.veen, which is an initiative to help organize refugee relief. This was around the time of the refugee crisis in 2015 or 16. I started organizing conferences like the European Ruby Conference, where same thing, started out gently and then became part of the team. I teach some free boot camps with free code camps materials, and then I started contributing to free code camps. And you're noticing a pattern, right? Like I started out like that, and nowadays I'm helping out at DistributeAid, which is a humanitarian aid delivery NGO, and I'm having just the most wonderful time. I'm actually doing developer relations for them, which is great fun. But okay, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. When we talk about contributing to open source, what probably, especially if you're getting started, comes to mind are these, right? the GitHub green squares. And a lot of time these are used to sort of like measure how much you're in open source. But what I want to do today is argue what we can do to measure beyond that. And of course, they might look like commits as well. I have no idea what I was doing here. It was last year. Something with React, I guess. Well begun is half done. That's a very me commit. What I want to talk about today is non-code contributions, which if you haven't heard them, maybe the name is self-explanatory, any contributions that don't involve code. And what I want to argue today is how wonderful and gratifying it is to be able to contribute to open source this way, especially when we're leveraging our existing skills that we might be bringing into tech or skills that we've picked up along the years. And you might be wondering, okay, but I write code. Why would I want to contribute to open source this way? And now I'm going to do that thing, you know, like in films or TV shows where they say the title of the movie like in the middle of it, you know, so I'm going to bring up the initial slide again. Because there's more to open source than code. And I like to, like, non-code contributions is a good name. I also like calling it open source beyond code. And of course, we could start asking yourself, why contribute to open source in the first place? And of course, I'm going to skip over the whole arguments of like, it's good for your career, you're giving back and all that, especially if you're getting started. We're told a lot at the beginning, especially nowadays, that a great way to build up a portfolio and get hired is to do free work on open source for companies. And this is, of course, this can be a risky, responsibility-wise things to say. But what I want to argue here is that if you want to, here's a way that you can. When we think of an open source project, okay, I'm not very good at illustration, so I'm using lots of like clip art from Canva, so forgive me. But so we've got our box and we've got our code in the box, right? That's our open source project. We usually think about the code when it comes to open source. But I would also like to illustrate how important it is to also think of the community around that project, and more importantly, how that code and that community fit into the wider open source world. I wonder how the color contrast is. Ah, cool, great. And so like, I think especially that third category is really important for looking at how we can contribute beyond code. But I haven't really mentioned really why contribute beyond code. And I'm going to give a few arguments that worked for me in the past, and maybe there's some, like if you want to have an open space about this later, hint, hint, we can do that. I'd love to hear more from you. One big one for me was getting out of the comfort zone. I felt very intimidated at the beginning to contribute code and have it be bad and be told, please go away. Not that that happened, but it was still a fear, you know? There is so much that goes into open source maintainership that we take for granted, especially on a maintainer's shoulders who are probably overworked and do this in their spare time, that if we can contribute these ways that help them make this more manageable is extremely important, especially if you bring in that fresh perspective. This is something I value so much because like if you've been in, you know, has anybody heard of the curse of knowledge? You know, when you're sort of like in like, so like, what's it called? Like, all the way in deep in your code and you forget what it's like to come into this project for the first time or set up for the first time or clone for the first time. Improving this onboarding is something that I find really important when bringing in new contributors. And let's be honest, if you're shy like me, it's a really good way to meet people and expand your network. And you know, networking is not a bad thing. You know, so I used to think of networking as this sort of like pair of stuffy business people exchanging business cards, but it's beyond that, isn't it? It's what we're doing here. You know, we're getting to know each other, we're expanding ourselves and like growing our horizons. And I think that's really important. So what I want to do today is highlight some ways of contributing beyond code. And of course, invite all of you to also share with me what are some that I might have missed. I'm going to get the immediate one out of the way, right? Expanding, I mean, I could argue that there's a lot of code in this too, but documentation. I think that being able to take a look at a README or like a contributing guide or something like this, and being able to discern what works for you and what doesn't, and maybe fix some wording. I'm not saying like go into a bunch of these and spam like one, you know, changing from American to British spelling or something. But finding ways to expand these documentations, adding FAQs, like the questions that you're asking, we're going to get into that in a bit, can be really, really helpful for getting started. And a lot of projects like Free Code Camp have contributing guidelines that are massively expensive. And actually, that's my first ever contribution to Free Code Camp where I was live streaming and I was doing the setup. And when I live stream, I tend to get a little bit nervous, and so I read everything and I talk a lot so that I feel less silly. But what happened was I realized as I was reading out loud, I don't want to say literally, but I tripped over a typo. Right? I was reading, I was like, oh, hold on, that's a typo. And then I immediately went to GitHub. And that's how I contributed. It was great, a really positive experience. I'm getting excited. Cool. Let's talk about blogging, right? This is, and I think now we're starting to expand into these ways of contributing beyond code that don't show up as a green square or some kind of measured on a project's portfolio, but we'll get into that a bit more. Every contribution you make inform as a blog, even if you're just adding your insights or just, sharing your experiences, in a way, what you're doing is contributing to that project widely. Because then when folks find your blog post, they can find ways. So for example, this one here, I was working on a little point of sale system in my freelance days, and I was, learning how to update data across multiple browser tabs using Vue and Vuex. It was great fun. And I wrote a blog post about it, and I'm still getting emails to this day being like, hey, thank you for doing this. And this is contributing to open source. Same goes for trying stuff out. Remember what I mentioned about the curse of knowledge, right? The README was written a long time ago. If you're working on Mac OS, they release a new version every year, and stuff breaks a lot if you're one of the first people to update. Or there's new versions of tooling, and you're gonna get errors like random. This was at a time when I used to develop a lot on Windows subsystem for Linux, and stuff broke for me a lot. And in a way, I found this really helpful to just go to the maintainers and be like, hey, this didn't work for me right out of the box, but this is a solution that worked for me, and then you can make a contribution in the form of hey, I'm on WSL, how do I install? And then you can have, actually Free Code Camp has one of those instructions for WSL, and I massively appreciate that. Let's talk about issue triage. If you're an open source maintainer like Distribute8 here, you're gonna have a lot of issues, and you're gonna have lots of people opening issues, and then you're going to run out of space for them, and then you're gonna not being able to keep up with them. And what some projects will do, I'm not saying go do this with every project. What some projects will do is open up the triage, that is the management of these issues, the trying out of solutions, asking questions to the community. And this is something that Kubernetes project does, which I love, inviting folks to help with the management of these issues. And this is something that you can do with your open source projects as well, or go to other open source projects and help with that. Isn't that wonderful? In fact, there's a platform called codetriage.com where you can find issues that need triaging. Let's talk about code reviews for a second. This was a way that I really appreciated being able to get into open source, was when I was making contributions. For example, this is one for the Rails Grow Summer of Code platform. I hope it's not it's a bit small, sorry about that. What I'm getting here is some feedback from somebody who doesn't usually contribute, but came and took a look and added some suggestions to make this better for me. And that for me was really, really helpful for, feeling more comfortable and safe contributing to this project. So if you can, and the project invites you to do it, absolutely go and give some feedback if you can. Giving feedback is also, even if you're getting started, asking those questions is really helpful for, establishing what you can ask and what you can't. So yeah, answering questions, and I'm sure we've all done this before, gone to Stack Overflow. Here I am having an issue with Docker which somebody helped me with, thankfully. Answering questions, I'm a big fan of taking that knowledge, putting it on paper or putting it in a blog post or in an answer, because it forces you to explain it in a way that you can understand it better. And I think there's a lot of merit to that. Same goes for asking questions, by the way. I've been saying that a little bit today. Taking the moment, and we were talking about this in open spaces as well, lending that privilege in a way that even though you might know the answer or bringing out that, bringing out that explanation in a way that can be helpful for others down the line to understand is really important as well. When it comes to events, I find it really important to start out at any stage that you can. When I was getting started with events, I was volunteering at loads of them. One of my favorite conferences in the world is woojs.de, where it takes place in Bochum in Germany, if anybody knows Bochum, Huidobro.js. It's a great conference. And I was just, helping out with, a little bit of registration, and then later on I started doing a little bit of emceeing, and it was great fun and a great way to like integrate myself into that open source community. Same goes for localization, by the way. Like I speak English, Spanish, and German myself, and a lot of projects invite you to contribute for other speakers, because, for speakers of other spoken languages, because not everybody is fluent, in English, and getting started, it can be so helpful to have these instructions in other spoken languages. And those platforms that make that easier, all the better. Once you've been volunteering for a while, you can, of course, start organizing events. I've been helping organize the Vienna Ruby meetup, the React Ruby meetup, getting a little bit started in the Docker Vienna meetup. It's a lot of fun for getting to know people and encouraging them and bringing out the best in that community. Which goes beyond that, doesn't it? For hackathons or other kinds of these events that are more hands-on, you can provide, like one thing we did with Distributate many years ago was host an ensemble programming event where we would just sort of like rotate navigators and drivers, if you're familiar with pair programming, where you have one person on the keyboard, the other person explaining, but then you've got an ensemble of folks who are giving suggestions and this sort of thing. Like facilitating this was hugely rewarding and a great way for getting folks just a little bit more comfortable in getting started with contributing to your project. And again, bringing those skills that you have in other areas of your work can definitely come into open source as well. I'm going to share a recent funny story with y'all. What you see here is me using Figma for the first time in my life, as you can tell probably. I was making a logo for the inaugural Queer.js meetup in Vienna. I have stickers, by the way, if anybody wants them afterwards. And I was making if you're familiar with Vienna, they're very famous. One of the landmarks is the Riesenrad, the big red Ferris wheel. And I was working on this, and then I was struggling a little bit because it's my first time using Figma. Figma's great, don't get me wrong. And then I messaged my friend Sarah, and I was telling her like, oh yeah, I'm having a great time learning Figma. This is really good. And then she goes like, I got these from like a SVG store online, right? So hey, I still contributed in a way. Same goes for giving talks, by the way. Like I think, share it like we do with like blog posts and other of these. And what I'm getting here is into a pattern of sharing knowledge. This is something I really enjoy doing. Giving talks at conferences and sharing about different open source projects, or even, getting challenged by folks who attend these and ask me questions about them. I think this is a really good way to keep these conversations going and improve these individual projects, which of course goes into video content creation. Does anybody here make video out of curiosity? Cool, I see a couple hands. You are so much braver and better at this than I am. I enjoy live streaming myself. In fact, back when I was working at CodeC as head of open source, one of my favorite things to do, like we did this during Hacktoberfest, I did this thing called Let's Onboard Ramón to project X, Y, or Z. And so I would put on my little sailor outfit, as you can see here, and I would like go and make a contribution to a project with one of the maintainers, like without ever having looked at the code. It was great fun because it gave that project like the opportunity to showcase what their onboarding experience is like, and then they get some good feedback out of that. Same goes for helping run social media, for sharing stuff on social media, but also helping run social media accounts for lots of different projects. If they have committees that allow you to do this, this is absolutely a way that you can get started. And of course, same goes for content curation. You've probably seen lots of different newsletters that allow you to, you've seen loads of folks have newsletters where they gather up the best or their favorite content from that week and send it out. This is something that you can do as well. If projects are large and have teams, another way that you can contribute is through helping coordinate that project. Of course, this is once you've established yourself as a member of that team. And that, I think, is something that's pretty important to distinguish how good it is to be a part of a team that's something bigger than you are, and still something that you can wear on your heart. Same goes for moderation. Oftentimes, the open source projects that allow this will have codes of conduct, and these will need enforcement. Hopefully separate from the organizing team themselves. And this is something that you can do. You can go and volunteer to different, I have Electron.js here as an example of a well-enforced code of conduct, I hope. And I hope that what you can look at this and say is like, what can I do to make these open source projects a safer place? Because, and there's lots of examples of how to do this. For example, the Rails Girls Summer of Code used to have a trust committee where folks separate from us would make sure that people felt safe. Same goes for organizing events, of course. Finally, when you're getting started in open source, I think it's important to remember that having a helping hand, if possible, is really, really helpful. A lot of the help that I've gotten early in my career, I owe to the people who have taken the time to walk me through an issue or walk me through getting started. And so what my friend Jessica does is she'll hold open advice one-on-ones. And these are all open source online so that folks can get, make an appointment with her and, even spin this off and make their own. So I've been doing the same for Spanish speakers. But okay, we've been talking about lots of different ways that we can get started in contributing beyond code, but what if I'm maintaining an open source project? What can I do to make it more approachable to facilitate contributing to open source? I think it's really important to establish from the beginning how important it is to have a safe, inclusive, and effective community. Sure, we can slap a code of conduct on our project, but that's only as good as long as it's enforced. So having a good enforcement policy is extremely important. We've heard this before, tagging issues is highly critical, not just for saying, hey, this is a good first issue, but what kind of contributions you can make that go beyond code. And what you want to do is take that opportunity to advocate for the community around your open source project. And I do not mean just developers, I mean everyone. Just like maintainers, just like code contributors, people get busy, people have changes in circumstances in their lives, and being able to accommodate those is very important. What I'm trying to get at today is how difficult it is to measure and quantify these contributions because they oftentimes don't show up as green squares. What can we do as maintainers to quantify these, to qualify these? And here's a couple of examples from projects I've seen that I really like. For example, what DistributeAid has is a contributor MD file, where once you make a contribution, we ask you to please add your name to this contributor file, and then we highlight that in our different places. And some of these are even built in with mechanisms for allowing folks to add themselves and then show up on a README. If you have any further ideas on how we can do this, I'd love to hear them, please. Getting to the end. If you're interested in getting started with contributing beyond code, I have some action items that I'd love to suggest. Number one, find these problems, identify these problems. If you're feeling like, hey, this doesn't work quite right, that is absolutely valid and worth pursuing. If you have a solution that you can map out, absolutely go and propose it, circle back. People love it when you make a contribution that you come back again. But of course, and this is very important, practice your open source etiquette. I've got a resource here that you can read up on. And when you're doing all of this, most important of all, be intentional and be strategic. Minimize harm at all costs. Here's some stuff you can read up on that I highly recommend. Kubernetes, there's Navendu has a really great blog post on how to make non-code contributions. There's my slides. MDN has a great article on open source etiquette. And my friend Ursula gave a talk called Give Back to Open Source, Make an Impact and Build Your Career on the sort of like career building path of open source, contributing beyond code. And finally, I want to recommend a book that really impacted how I approach open source. Has anybody heard of this book, Working in Public, The Making and Maintenance of Open Source Software by Nadia Egbal? It is terrific. I highly recommend reading it. Thanks, everyone.